So I'm going to share with you the latest results of my, what I like to call epistemological tinkerings today. The work's entitled Meta-Semantic Painting, and I want to explore each notion in sequence, suggesting them as connected terms. But I want to highlight current themes in art theory. For example, painting in its post-medium condition, and align those with ideas in general semantics and communication theory. So, as ever, I'm going to pause along the way for the visuals to catch up. But what you're going to see is essentially the process, the ideas that lead up to the finished images. Okay, so we'll start with the idea of meta. So we're used to the prefix meta meaning after, behind, changed, altered, or higher or beyond. From the Greek term meta, in the midst of, in common with. The term is applied to many disciplines in contemporary culture, historically associated with the original branch of philosophy, metaphysics, which is famous for asking the most rudimentary, problematic questions about the nature of being. Korzybski, for Korzybski, these questions were a bit like hunting of the snark. They kind of involved purely fictional entities for him. He didn't seem to be a big fan of metaphysics. He writes in Science and Sanity, the guessing, ascribing of a fanciful, mostly primitive assumed structure to the world is precisely what philosophy and metaphysics do. The empirical search for world structure and the building of new theories of necessary or similar structure is what science does. So despite this, Korzybski did seem to see the importance of self-awareness and self-reflexivity, an important aspect of how the term meta is often used. So the term as a standalone adjective has also been further popularised by the work of Douglas Hofstadter in books like Gödel, Escher, Bach, published in 1979, and Metamagical Themas, 1985, which highlight how self-reference contributes to knowledge, and it's that aspect of the term meta that I want to stipulate over the course of this work. Of the many common uses of the word meta, the term meta, it might be useful just to skip through a few of them because it seems to be a term that's used more and more these days. So for example, you have metadata, which came from library cataloguing systems in the 90s. You have the term meta-ethics, meta-language, as we've seen earlier, meta-fiction, metacognition, metagaming, where the notion of emergent gameplay encourages players to complete in-game solutions using creative methodologies that the game designers didn't actually see. You've got meta-programming, meta-logic, and these are just a few examples, essentially, in any field that looks into structures and behaviours that generates and support the discipline could be described as having a meta-awareness. So primary for me in this piece of work are the following three applications. There's meta-painting, which we'll explore further on, meta-semantics, which is posited by Postman as a strategy in which we put ourselves psychologically outside a context of a situation or a semantic environment. And then also the term meta-communication as well is going to be important to us. So meta-communication, made popular by Gregory Bateson, credits Benjamin Lee Whorf in his 1954 essay, Theory of Play and Fantasy. Bateson described how after visiting a zoo and observing monkeys, he noticed that the monkeys would often bare their teeth and nip each other, almost as if they were in a real fight. But he realised that such actions were dependent upon a tacit understanding between the monkeys that this is play, and that there was a shared knowledge that the actions in which we engage do not denote what those actions for which they stand would denote. So Bateson goes on to explain that denotative communication, as it occurs at the human level, is only possible after the evolution of a complex set of metalinguistic but not verbalised rules which govern how words, sentences shall be related to objects and events, and it's therefore appropriate to look for the evolution of such metalinguistic and metacommunicative rules at a pre-human and pre-verbal level. So Bateson, who earlier in this particular essay references Korzybski in the map-territory relation, alludes here to unspoken silent levels that are full of information and that are and the pre-human origins of the mechanics of verbalised communication. So following Bateson, you've got the Palo Alto School, developing 5 basic axioms of communication, including the notion that we cannot not communicate. But if we cannot not communicate, it's impossible. If it's impossible not to communicate, it's also impossible to react to all of the communicative stimulus and to successfully receive all messages. And that led me to look into the work of Don Faban, who writes in his Communications, The Transfer of Meaning in 1968, we react only to a few of all the waves of energy that ceaselessly pour in upon us from all directions. The spectrum of visible light, our window to the world, is only a tiny band out of all the waves of energy our instruments tell us are out there. What we can talk about or write about is only a very small part of what is going on out there. Okay. So having looked into the idea of meta-communication, we'll now move on to the idea of the semantic. So according to Korzybski, the term semantic is derived from Greek semantikos, to signify. It was introduced into literature by Briel in 1897. He defines semantic reactions as psychological reactions in connection with the meanings of symbols and events. And in Science and Sanity, he writes, the working tool of psychophysiology is found in the semantic reaction. This can be described as the psychological reaction of a given individual to words and language and other symbols and events in connection with their meanings. So for Korzybski, a positive trait of the term semantic is that it's non-elementalistic. As we know, to be elementalistic is to separate things which empirically can't be separated. For example, a conscious organism, including humans, cannot be split into body and mind. So as a non-elementalistic term, the word semantic doesn't attempt this split, and that is its functionality for Korzybski. Around 20 years after Korzybski published these insights, we find precisely this emotional and intellectual functionality of the term semantic exploited in the work of Charles Osgood and his partners, creating a book called The Measurement of Meaning in 1957. So in this, Osgood devised the semantic differential. Now, the semantic differential is an attempt to create a reliable quantitative measure of connotative and denotative meaning. So experiments with the differential began by Osgood and his co-researchers positing a semantic space and asking the participants to choose where his or her position may lay on a scale between 2 polar adjectives, for example, adequate, inadequate, good, evil, valuable, worthless. So the modern day customer feedback questionnaire is a great example of how this system is used for a trusted evaluation today. This kind of semantic space that Osgood posits attempts to pinpoint semantic reactions within its own sort of Euclidean framework between 2 poles, with the assumption that there are such things as opposite terms, forming the coordinates within which data is captured. A far more fluid approach to semantic space can be found in what Neil Postman would call a semantic environment, defined as, first of all, people, second, their purposes, Third, the general rules of the discourse by which such purposes are usually achieved. And fourth, the particular talk actually being used in a situation. So these are complex environments, and nested within these environments are further sub-environments. For example, the confession box is a sub-environment of religion. So Postman's sketch of a non-Euclidean semantic space reminds us that communication is a situation in which people participate as a consequence of many other transactions of the organism as a whole in an environment. The notion of a semantic environment realises the precarious nature of communications, accepting that this is a precondition to work from and derive better communication. So he writes, the greater one's awareness of the purposes and structures of a different semantic environment, the greater one's sensitivity to the precariousness of all social order, and that is of all communication. Postman later on notes the usefulness of meta-semantic questions in the fact that they are neither a catechism nor an exact science, but a kind of multi-pointed compass which directs where we shall look, but not what we shall see. A multi-pointed compass sounds like a tricky tool for navigation to me, but it can point us in the right general direction, even if it's used in relation to a map that is not the territory. So finally, we'll focus upon the semantic environment generated by painting itself. Since medieval times, painting shows examples of reflecting inward on itself, but it's only recently that meta qualities of painting have been explicitly referenced and theorised as a trope. So, an exhibition at the Prado in Spain in 2016-2017 was entitled Meta-Painting, A Journey into the Idea of Art. That focused on paintings that referred to painting itself. For example, paintings which included painters painting, figures looking out of the picture, as well as a playful inclusion of a room which was just based around works that were inspired by Don Quixote. And that was included because Don Quixote was seen as one of the first examples of metafiction, or a book within a book. Also, prior to this, you have art historians like Victor Stoichita writing a book in 1997 called The Self-Aware Image, an insight into early modern meta-painting. This examines reflexivity in 16th and 17th century painting. So in this, Stoichita explores the ways that paintings themselves commented on representation, on the techniques and signifying strategies of oil painting. One example that Stoichita refers to is a painting by El Greco, which is called, there it is, View of Toledo with Map. Okay, so this is painted in 1610, and in this painting we kind of see El Greco as a proto-Korzybskian, emphasising that the territory and the map are separate, whilst ingeniously using the potentials of painting to include the two within the same image. Of course, we don't suggest here that El Greco is predicting Korzybski by 300 years. However, he's certainly making a statement about the ability of the medium, and by doing this, the painting communicates on the meta level and exposes potentials and limitations of the medium. El Greco is illustrating that he cannot show all of the city, whose expanse is better depicted by the map, but he also wants to show the majesty and the spirit, which is far better depicted by his actual landscape. So prior to the 20th century, the notion of the medium in art meant the comfortably separate realms of painting, drawing and sculpture. The physical distinctions between each medium held their integrity. These physical boundaries came under scrutiny in the early 20th century with the advent of Dada, Cubism, for example, Picasso and Braque's relief paintings that were painted, they were like painted wall-based sculptures. Further on, in the mid-20th century, media boundaries came under the intense focus of art critic Clement Greenberg, who developed the theory which became known as Modernism and is closely associated with the notion of medium specificity. With this notion, Greenberg sought out purity by suggesting that all paintings and painterly acts were primarily concerned with themselves and the flatness of the structures and supports on which the brushstrokes were spread, swiped or splattered. For Greenberg, there was little more than this, but this was enough to cultivate a formalist sensibility. The term medium became, in Korzybskian parlance, an over-identified term. It could not be mentioned without association to the theoretical infrastructure of modernism. And subsequently, art historians, writers and critics have attempted to distance themselves from that term. This, of course, most noted by Tom Wolfe in his book The Painted Word, in which he states modern art has become completely literary. The paintings and other works exist only to illustrate the text. For Wolfe, these painted words flooded the semantic environment of mid-20th century American painting and created what Korzybski might term a confusion of orders of abstraction, or what Neil Postman would call crazy talk. The painter followed the theories rather than the other way around, and the whole environment became self-perpetuating. Also, art critic W.J.T. Mitchell has noted that this critical discourse was as crucial to modernist painting as the Bible and mythology were to traditional narrative painting. So to try to extricate art criticism from medium specificity, Rosalind Krauss coined the term post-medium. So in the preface to her 1992 study, A Voyage on the North Sea, Krauss notes that medium specificity ignored more subtle philosophical questions that painting could pose. For example, the painter, Maurice Dennis, writes in 1890, "It is well to remember that a picture, before being a battle horse or a nude woman or some other anecdote, is essentially a plain surface covered with colours assembled in a certain order." So modernist interpretations of such artists' insights were used as a proof that there was an essentialist reduction towards flatness that implied a specific orthogenesis of painting. But Dennis's point is more sophisticated than that. There's a complexity involved in the notion of order, which Krauss points out as Dennis is describing the layered, complex relationship that we would call a recursive structure, a structure that is some of the elements of which will produce the rules that generate the structure itself. The post-medium condition of painting involves more philosophical curiosity about the potentials of the medium in contemporary culture. Krauss's use of the term recursive references the notion of the thing defined in terms of itself, but also suggests importance of deeper functions of order and sequence of the process. So the semantic environment cultivated by Krauss's post-medium condition imparts a structural re-evaluation involving the development of non-elementalistic approaches to thinking about the medium. There are further examples of art theorists, critics and historians who develop this more fluid, non-elementalistic approach. In an essay entitled "There Are No Visual Media," W.J.T. Mitchell argues for a more nuanced taxonomy of media. Mitchell's argument leads him to declare that all media are mixed. He writes, "The very notion of medium already entails some mixture of sensory, perceptual and semiotic elements. This conclusion does not lead to the impossibility of distinguishing one medium from another. What it makes possible is a more precise differentiation of mixtures." So differentiation is the key here. Mitchell's argument is that all media should be approached as material social practices and never as having a singular elemental essence. Media should be viewed more like a recipe in cooking, having different nuances, combinations and ratios of input. Furthermore, David Josselit's essay in 2009 called Painting is Beside Itself actually places painting in a fluid environment by posing the question, how does a painting belong to a network? Describing painting as having a transitive quality, meaning having the ability to carry over into an object, Josselit imagines painting in such an environment would have capacity to hold in suspension the passages internal to a canvas and those external to it. In this regard, painting since the 1990s has folded into itself so-called institutional critique without falling into the modernist trap of negation, where works on canvas are repeatedly reduced to degree 0. So it's irresistible again to highlight the cooking analogy there. When you're making a cake mixture, you're described as folding the stuff in. And this folding in of institutional critique or modernism identifies our painting, bigger than any theoretic structure that attempts to define it, as absorbed parts of its own structure in a recursive manner, highlighted by Rosalind Krauss. So painting is not something we can easily isolate from its communicative context and transmissions. A further example is found in art historian Isabel Grore's book, 2018, The Love of Painting. And if you're a painter, this is kind of like the painterly equivalent of the joy of sex. For Grore, it's impossible to contain painting in the constraints of the canvas when its own indexicality, the marks made, have a transcendent quality. So Grore writes that visible brushstrokes and glossy oil paint can trigger a haptic longing to touch the painting's surface. Moreover, these haptic events give rise to what I call vitalistic fantasies. For example, the belief, going back to painting theorists of antiquity, that paintings bear some resemblance to their creators. So Grore's comment there encompasses both the notion of self-reference and the notion of painting extending beyond itself. Vitalistic fantasies remind us that an organism, a person, has made an object, and this creates a ghost-like quality of authorship and a spectral presence. As well as this, Grore invokes the haptic potentials of painting, creating a synesthetic quality to our experience the medium. Given these examples, an accurate evaluation of painting, more in line with what is going on, identifies the relation between the inside and the outside of the canvas. It's not necessarily a visual phenomena, but should be experienced more as an organism as a whole in an environment. So, by way of concluding, Grore's analysis alludes to the fact that ideas of the dissolution of boundaries in painting are by no means unique to contemporary culture, but were present in antiquity and suggested throughout post-Marxist art criticism. There's a commonality in these theories, though, that we've explored. All refer to ideas of structure and differentiation, and as we know, there are two ideas that are fundamental to general semantics. As we are aware, the functioning tool of the system, the structural differential, enables us to train our awareness in these characteristics, which are vital to accurate evaluation. In describing the structural differential, J. Samuel Bois highlights that its name clearly shows Korzybski's concern for two key ideas. A, differences which make each person, thing, or situation unique in space and time, and B, structure, which accounts for the inner arrangement of parts or elements of each unique person or thing or situation attracted as a distinct whole from the cosmic space-time flow. So whilst recognising that which is unique in painting, its difference, the theories we have encountered argue for a more fluid notion of structure involving dispersion of boundaries, but not, as a result, dissolution from the central core of uniqueness. So, for example, Krauss's sketch of the post-medium condition implies a structural revision that leaves behind the husk of modernism in order to incorporate painting as a whole. Mitchell sees painting as part of a larger network or communicative structure which must involve a more nuanced taxonomy of media. or a differentiation of mixtures, as he puts it. And Joslet sees painting as besides itself, having stepped out of its structure, physical and theoretical, via its transitive passages. We've also got, of course, with Isabel Graw, we accept the remarkable idea that painting can be totally disembodied from the traditional canvas or support and still be present as a quasi-person. So painting, almost, it's assumed, can exist without painting. So if we agree with Korzybski that the content of knowledge is exclusively structural, we see that these theories advocate an approach which is more similar in structure to the world, and we see painting as a tool which can cultivate our awareness of this as a whole in an environment orientation. Okay, so if these things coming together mean that art theory is becoming more Korzybskian and therefore more sane, does it mean that our experience of art, and specifically painting, can be regarded as an exercise in realigning our sensibilities? Does it mean that the experience of art, and specifically painting, can be regarded as an exercise in realigning our sensibilities and becoming better general semanticists? If this is the case, I sincerely hope so.